Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're watching a special edition of The Listening Post in which we hit pause, rewind, and then play on the story of the Arab revolutions. It's been a bit more than 6 months since the Arab uprisings began, with a slow burn in Tunisia that then caught fire and swept through Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain, Libya, and Syria. For a media show like this one, there are myriad angles to cover. Embattled governments locking out reporters, shutting down the internet and phone networks, and blocking and jamming satellite television signals.
The authorities shut down the channel's operations.
Protesters commandeering the web, turning social media into the most powerful subversive tool of our time. And news outlets caught in the middle, dealing with torrents of information and misinformation and trying to make sense of it. So we're breaking with our usual format this week and going with a full edition, a compilation of some of our previous reports that we've turned into a chronology of the media side of the Arab Revolution story. Our starting point, Tunisia.
President Ben Ali has stepped down.
In the early stages of the Tunisian uprising, most foreign media outlets were locked out of the story by the authorities. Images came from two sources, a select few from government-approved media and a torrent of social media picked up by channels like Al Jazeera.
وأظهرت صور على شبكة الإنترنت.
I recorded the protests moment by moment using my cell phone, and I got the video out to news agencies via the internet and Facebook.
What they wanted to do really was to communicate with other friends, other relatives, other cities within Tunisia, but the power of the internet and the power of traditional media to magnify those cases allowed for it to reach a critical mass. It ended up being a building tool for this movement, a building tool for the entire country and perhaps the entire region in the coming years.
I was definitely afraid at first, but I wanted everything we were filming to reach the outside world. We knew nobody was going to come down here and nobody could reach us. Thank God we were able to reach them.
This is not the first time that citizen journalists providing information and images have collaborated with mainstream media in telling the story of a political revolt.
Iran's educated youth has turned to Twitter.
It happened in Iran in 2009 and Egypt 5 years earlier. However, the relationship between new and traditional media has matured.
If you go back to, say, Egypt in 2004, 2005, you had many of the same things that you saw in Tunisia. You had activists who were using blogs, forums, and various kinds of internet sites, including Facebook. And you had Al Jazeera and the other satellite television stations that were covering the demonstrations and the protests. So the raw material is the same, but this time there was I would say, a much tighter integration and rapid interaction between the two. You need to have a framing process. It's not just the pictures, it's what people make of the pictures.
For the Tunisian authorities, that collaboration, new media feeding material to mainstream outlets, was a two-headed monster. They could not stop thousands of social networkers doing their thing, so in the regime's dying days, it focused its efforts on television.
The police were going around the cafes in Tunis, checking whether the television set in the cafe was tuned to Al Jazeera, and if it was, they were telling the cafe owner to change the channel. So, I mean, obviously, that is a huge thing.
Tunisia is now chock full of journalists, many of them working for Arabic language media. They're covering not just the post-Ben Ali story, but also the possible repercussions elsewhere in the Middle East.
Clearly, what happened in Tunis and its media coverage around the Arab world will be an impetus for similar political challenges that will be manifested in different ways across the region. Now that it's started, it will inspire people throughout the Arab world who are similarly fed up with some of the same conditions that the Tunisians suffered to push their regimes and demand change and demand their rights as citizens.
But that's only if other Arab governments who have watched events unfold on Al Jazeera and other Arabic language media let that happen.
The other lesson is that they should do whatever they can to silence the media, to crack down hard early so that protests can't begin to snowball and get out of control. Much as I would like to think that the response will be towards more openness, I worry that it will actually be in the opposite direction.
What we're seeing in Egypt is that there is a momentum now that is in all likelihood unstoppable.
You know, people talk about televising the revolution. It's tweeting the revolution, Facebooking the revolution, videotaping the revolution, whatever we can.
Egypt erupted January 25th. 2 nights later, the government disconnected Egyptians from the World Wide Web.
The Egyptian government has stepped up its clampdown on the media and communication services.
Since the early morning hours of Friday, the internet has effectively been shut down in Egypt.
When internet connections came back briefly, we managed to speak with Mohammed Selim about his 6 days in Egypt's internet vacuum.
I truly missed Facebook, I missed Twitter, I missed the internet, but there's something more powerful was being organized in the Egyptian street.
At that point, Al Jazeera became tremendously important because it became one of the few ways of seeing what was going on directly in Egypt.
The next clampdown was on television. It came January 30th.
6 Al Jazeera news staff were arrested, then released the day after the authorities shut down the channel's operations.
The network continued to broadcast, and when it was bumped off Egyptian satellite provider Nilesat, other regional broadcasters carried the Al Jazeera signal into the country.
Like channels like NBN of Lebanon, Al Jadid of Lebanon, Al Mustaqilla, which is based in London, are broadcasting Al Jazeera for many of the Egyptians. Other channels are there. If you want to listen to it, use your remote control and tune to it. Nobody can force me in 2011 to watch whatever I don't want to watch.
They think that if you can just shut down the internet, if you can just shut down Al Jazeera or satellite television or shut down communication, basically, you can shut down anger. You cannot shut down people's anger at a dictator.
First, they ignore you. Then they laugh at you. Then they fight you.
And then you win.
أيها المواطنون في هذه الظروف العصيبة.
The media moment for which President Omar Suleiman will be forever remembered by Egyptians, when he announced the end of the Mubarak era.
Look at these scenes of euphoria and celebration.
It was carried on all kinds of news networks, including the satellite channels that 1 day earlier, Suleiman had accused of provoking Egypt's political crisis.
Don't listen to satellite television stations who are trying to create unrest and division and to weaken Egypt and distort its image.
Suleiman had criticized international news outlets before, and when he did that, attacks against foreign journalists grew more and more frequent.
You saw a very aggressive campaign on Egyptian state media that essentially fed this public incitement against foreign elements that were behind the protests. It wasn't about whether you were from Canada or Spain or whether you were Al Jazeera. It became a sense of hysteria and xenophobia against foreigners in the country, and most of those were essentially journalists that were here to do their job and report to the world what was happening.
And not just foreigners. An Egyptian print reporter for Al Ta'awun, Ahmed Mohammed Mahmoud, was shot and killed by a sniper. But most of the journalists targeted were from the foreign media, CNN's Anderson Cooper among them, swarmed by a pro-Mubarak mob.
He's been hit now like 10 times.
Quite frankly, when American journalists are beaten on the ground in Cairo, it does become more real for the American public. Boy, did that ever backfire on the Mubarak regime.
Tonight we begin by focusing on the lies the Egyptian government continues to tell.
First Tunisia, then Egypt. This weekend the protests spread to Algeria and Yemen. it is worth revisiting a prophetic point made on this program just after the Tunisian government fell, on the evolution and impact of Arab satellite channels on politics in the region in the 15 years since the launch of Al Jazeera.
That initial 15 years was one in which the satellite stations played a role of kind of vicarious expressors of sentiment. Ordinary citizens could turn on Jazeera and see somebody criticizing the Egyptian leader or some Arab dictator that they didn't like. It didn't translate into a process of political change. Neither did any of the different forms of new media. As such, the media has now a dimension to it. Jazeera and the satellite Arab TV stations have a dimension which is beyond emotional letting off steam and actually mobilizing for political change. This is a historic moment, I think, in the modern Arab media.
Not even Hosni Mubarak, Egypt's former president, would argue with that. The Gaddafi speech was delivered on Libyan state-run television, where his son Saif appeared before him.
وايضا الناس من حقها لانها غاضبه وزعلة لان في موت في كذا.
To put Saif al-Islam's picture up on a big screen was asking for trouble. Of course they threw their shoes. And then to see Gaddafi under his umbrella later on, I mean, you know, there is truly an element of sort of Hitlerian dominance mixed with Walt Disney and, you know, Mickey Mouse in all this.
However, state-run TV is just a sideshow. Like Egypt and Tunisia, the Libyan story has been propelled by web video.
Gaddafi learnt from the mistakes in Egypt and Tunisia. He kicked out Al Jazeera, he kicked out all foreign correspondents. But the problem is, of course, that this is amateur footage, we can't substantiate it, and so it's given us this very blurry, chaotic understanding of what's actually been going on.
This is extraordinary because remember, Libya does not have the internet activism culture that exists in Tunisia or in Egypt, for instance, or even in Bahrain. So what we're seeing is that the people on the ground understood what happened in Tunisia and Egypt and Bahrain and knew that the internet is their ally.
From Tunis to Cairo and now Tripoli, the story arcs have been remarkably similar.
All the Arab dictators, one after the other, have all blamed the media for their situation. In particular, they've singled out Al Jazeera. So the fact that Gaddafi blamed the Arab media really is desperate. I don't think that Libyans would believe him for 1 minute. The fact is, Libyans know what kind of man he is better than anybody else. And they have, through the internet, an understanding of what's really happening.
The main storyline in Libya's civil war has the regime fighting the rebels. The second, the subplot, pits the regime against the international media, or at least some of them. Journalists from the New York Times, CNN, BBC's Arabic channel, Agence France Presse, Getty Images, and Al Jazeera have all been detained. They tell stories of intimidation, beatings, and mock executions.
At this moment, I felt that it's just minutes and they will shoot me.
An Al Jazeera cameraman, Ali Hassan al-Jabr, was killed in an ambush that the network called an assassination, and at least 6 Libyan journalists remain missing.
We've seen Gaddafi go to the farthest extremes to try and control the media message, shutting down of international media to literally pursuing journalists.
Gaddafi, you know, of course, is going to try to prevent anything resembling the truth from getting out, and I think that's why his thugs and his mercenaries have been, you know, so rough in their treatment of journalists that they have caught.
As deep as the conflict is between President Gaddafi and the international media, there is a symbiotic side to the relationship. Gaddafi has courted the media in the past, and the media are addicted to conflict, especially armed conflict. Muammar Gaddafi is providing them with one.
Media and war are intractable bedfellows. It's a very, very strange relationship. And then you've also got the sort of the insatiable desire on the part of audiences to consume information about war.
To bomb Gaddafi into submission.
It is during wartime that most media organizations experience a huge rating spike. CNN made their name in the international media sphere as a result of the first Gulf War. Al Jazeera's bread and butter has been conflict coverage over the past 10 or more years in the Arab world and across the globe, whether it's in Iraq or Afghanistan or Lebanon or Gaza. So really, war and media are part of the same animal.
In a country in the midst of a civil war with conflicting and confusing reports from the front lines, this was a much simpler story, but every bit as chilling. The story of a casualty of war, a woman who walked right into the foreign media's hotel in Tripoli.
I found myself walking into the room 10 yards behind Ayman al-Abadi, and I, like everyone else in the room, was taken completely by surprise when she started screaming at the top of her voice, "Do you see what this Gaddafi militia has done to me?" It was an electric moment.
She's been through this hellish ordeal, and she goes straight to where the foreign journalists are. Not the local journalists, she goes straight to where the foreign journalists are, and she starts to tell her story. And the hotel staff converge on her to stop her from speaking.
But she was still managing to tell us that, first of all, that she had been raped, she said, by as many as 15 men. She said that she had been tied up. She showed us marks on her wrists and on her ankles where she'd been bound up.
How are you going with her?
Whatever efforts the media corps made on Ayman al-Abadi's behalf came to naught.
Refusing to say where they are taking this woman.
She was taken away, no one knew where. And then came the regime's media counteroffensive via state-run TV.
State-controlled Libyan media had an anchor woman on who called her a prostitute, who called her a liar, who called her mentally unstable and an alcoholic.
حتى العاهرة أحيانا قد تكون عندها وطنية اتجاه الوطن عندما تعرف أن وطنها في خطر حتى العاهرة.
They've been trying to smear her ever since.
Then came the counteroffensive, delivered by the woman's mother via non-Libyan TV.
Her mother spoke to Jazeera Arabic, calling out Gaddafi by name. That was amazing. That kind of bravery is what it takes.
One story, two acts of bravery and defiance. A woman and her mother both saying the kinds of things that for years Libyans and other Arabs have been afraid to say to foreign reporters.
The security forces prevented the funeral.
There was a similar story in Syria when a human rights activist, Wissam Tarif, spoke to CNN on a condition of non-anonymity.
Why do you want us to use your name? Why is that so important?
Syrian people who are living abroad, who are calling Arab networks, TVs, and hiding their name, should stop it now. This element of fear has to be broken.
However, such stories, while noteworthy, newsworthy, remain the exception rather than the new rule. They represent significant cracks in the Arab world's wall of fear, but the wall remains.
People are terrified. I saw taxi drivers who had been arrested and pulled over and interrogated simply because they were giving us lifts around the city, come back into the car and their hands were trembling with fear. People are unwilling to talk because of what the regime has already done. Trust me, fear and loathing is alive and well in Libya today.
The Bahraini uprising did not start the way Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya did. Most of the Shia protesters were not calling for the overthrow of their Sunni government. They just wanted the same rights as the Sunnis. But that is not how the story has been reported in most of the Bahraini media.
Part of the media strategy of the Bahraini government has been to portray them as zealot Shias who are trying to take over the monarchy with the support of none other than the evil and hated Iran.
It fits into the comfortable narrative that we've grown accustomed to, that there is foreign meddling, that these are not, citizens asking for their inalienable rights, but rather that they are acting on behalf of a larger political player.
There are few media outlets in Bahrain the government does not control. One of them was Al Wasat, an opposition newspaper.
One of the founders of Al Wasat and one of its main financiers, Karim Fakhrawi, was detained by Bahraini authorities and was tortured so brutally in custody that he died. And the government's version of events was essentially that the man died of kidney failure. Well, I've seen post-mortem pictures of this man, and if he did in fact die of kidney failure, it's only because they beat him so badly, they caused him that kidney failure.
There was a similar story involving a blogger who reported on the protests, Zakaria al-Ashiri. Arrested on April 2nd, he died after a week in custody of what the authorities called sickle cell anemia. Again, the pictures belied the official story. Bahrain is a tiny country, a geopolitical microcosm of the Sunni-Shia divide, and that is reflected in the coverage by satellite news channels, like the Saudi-owned Al Arabiya and the Iranian Arabic-language Al Alam. Saudi Arabia is ruled by Sunnis, Iran by Shias.
You've got Al Arabiya, which from the outset had been incredibly accusatory towards the protesters, that it was an outright coup. And then you've got Al Alam, which decided to take the side of the protesters outright, and in some cases even foment sectarianism. You're starting to see state policy basically infiltrate broadcasting in such a way that you have a major polarization in how content is covered.
Al Jazeera has not escaped criticism on this story either. Activists say the network has not shown the same level of commitment on Bahrain as it has covering the other Arab uprisings.
There's a new maxim of the media landscape in the Arab world. If it's not on Al Jazeera, it's not news. And therefore, a lot of us activists have been working very hard in order to get coverage on both sides of Al Jazeera.
Al Jazeera is sensitive to those accusations and argues the conditions in Bahrain are different and more difficult.
When we covered Egypt, for example, Egypt was the only story at that time in the Arab world. For 18 days, our cameras were carrying live images from Tahrir Square. After that, the whole issue of Libya started, and then Yemen started, and now Syria started, and of course Bahrain before that. So this kind of crowded agenda and priorities on the screen made a lot of people feel that we are not dealing with Yemen as we deal with Egypt, or we're not dealing with Syria as we deal with Egypt, or with Bahrain. In Bahrain, the story of Bahrain as well was covered by Al Jazeera, and we had a correspondent in there before he was not allowed after that to come back. And he was covering the story. The Bahraini story is important, the Syrian story is important, all stories are important, but when you sit in front of the desk, you need to decide the weight of each story and the time allocated to the story based on how relevant the story is and how important the story for your general audience.
The activists driving the protests and the media outlets trying to cover them have learned a lot since the winds of change first started blowing through the Arab world. But so too have the governments involved.
Clearly, the Assad regime saw that if they are going to get ahead of the curve on this, they're going to have to use pretty massive violence and pretty massive police tactics and intelligence tactics. So if anything, the other examples that came before really, I think, helped to make the decision for the regime of whether it was going to proceed in a very hard stick direction or take a softer line.
And we will learn a new lesson from Syria, whether a government crushing the opposition and the voices of opposition and the voices of dissent, whether that will help or not. I think other countries are observing what's happening in Syria right now to see if that is the way to go.
It seems fairly evident that the Syrian government regards Al Jazeera right now as enemy number one in the media field, if not in the political field as well.
Al Jazeera has learnt that its missing journalist Dorothy Pavaz is now being held in Iran. It follows her deportation from Syria.
It's even more bitter because unlike in the situation in Libya and Egypt, the Syrian case is radically different because Syria long regarded Al Jazeera as essentially sympathetic to the resistance axis which it anchors. That said, the Syrians also realize that they're going to have to be pragmatic. In the more wide open media space that Middle Easterners live in, thankfully, it's going to be something that they're just going to have to come to terms with at some point.
The final word, the last soundbite in our summary of the media and the Arab Spring refers to Syria. But it applies to any country caught up in the uprisings, any government that has blocked satellite signals, the internet, or phone networks. They can lock the media down, they can even lock the media out, but they cannot silence the citizen journalists within.
The Syrian regime now fears a mobile phone more than anything, fears a camera more than anything, fears any form of communication more than anything.